So I guess we can start talking about this topic.
Oh, definitely we can, yeah. But, I think it would be better if you had specialists on the podcast.
You don't need a specialist for the podcast.
Oh.
You can actually try on your own.
Yeah, okay. So now we're the specialists, Mr. Specialist.
We can be. I mean, if you have prepared, then no problem. You can talk about any topic, but the problem is you haven't prepared for it.
Oh, yeah, I actually haven't, yeah. Okay, so this is an example of violent communication.
Violent and unhealthy communication.
Yeah.
So welcome to another Technologos podcast. Today we will introduce ECHO, which is an Erasmus Plus project that is managed by Sweden, National Agency of Sweden. We have MindfulnessForLife from EACEA, Technologos from Larnaca. And we will try to dive into this topic of healthy versus unhealthy communication. What was the unhealthy thing we tried doing earlier?
Well, I guess there were elements of sarcasm, maybe irony, maybe some name calling, disagreeing, with you pointing out that I haven't prepared. It's like, it's just pointing out the negatives of a situation and just pushing a person up front and saying, this is wrong, you did this wrong.
I guess we didn't even allow for each other space to reflect or communicate their thoughts. Skipping from one topic to another maybe, or interrupting.
Definitely. And I think that, before you could think about what the other person was saying, you were filling in your own answer. So instead of listening to the other person, you were focusing more on listening to your own thoughts. So there actually wasn't any conversation. It was just an argument,
It was, yeah. And definitely didn't actually help us solve the issue. It just created more anger and we attacked each other's ego. So how can we do this a bit better?
Well, I'd say maybe I'd suggest instead of, directly point out, I'd suggest that we could have a third person, for example, not substitute one of us to maybe have a third person that specializes in the field. And you could say, yeah, we could, but due to this and due to that, maybe there were some complications that we couldn't bring another person to the podcast. Or let's say we booked the room for today, there were no other slots. Like, we could have a conversation giving reasons for why this or that. And I could say, yeah, maybe they could add something more valuable to the conversation. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think.
So I guess to summarize your point here is maybe allowing our attention to focus on hearing what the other person has to say, rather than focusing and concentrating on what we'll say next.
Definitely. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, because the attention, when it's focused on attacking the other person, you don't actually listen and digest to what they have to say.
Yeah, and you don't actually understand the point that they're trying to make because your ego is so lifted at that moment when the other person is attacking you that you become so defensive.
Yeah.
You may use some arguments that, one, may be hurtful and two, maybe, pointless. They miss the point. Yeah.
And another very interesting and helpful technique is recentering. So it's very common that when we have an argument, we go on a tangent and we discuss a different topic to the one that actually has to be discussed.
Okay.
So maybe it would be nice one of us to recenter and bring the topic back to the initial conversation, which was how to actually carry out this podcast.
Yeah, definitely. But the thing is, it depends on how emotionally charged the conversation is, because if there's mixed feelings, for example, like anger, like sadness, or maybe too much excitement, these are feelings that won't let you recenter very easily. Like, you might feel, like someone's like that you've been treated unfairly, like someone, he's cheated you into doing this. So, or like you feel like your point is stronger than someone else's. So,
Yes.
Okay, obviously not being a specialist, I'm just talking on human experience,
Yes.
But, to recenter someone, one of the two people must be, grounded enough to be able to bring the other person down with them to create a calm atmosphere. But if both people are very, agitated, it's much more difficult to recenter.
Yeah. There's another technique that we can use, which is called feeding. So basically speaking one thing at a time and allowing the other person to understand it and digest it before actually bringing something else in the conversation. So feeding as a technique is, yes, I wanted to talk about the importance of this podcast being carried out, but maybe I should focus more on this rather than start adding more elements to it, so I don't confuse you and I don't create more anxiety to you.
Well, definitely, but for that to work, it's the same thing. I think it like overlaps with what I said before. The other person must not be emotionally agitated.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, let's say you're having an argument with your parents and they say something. It triggers some emotions within you that are like, it's negative emotions, that you feel unfair, you feel like they said something that, it traps you, it imprisons you in some sort of way, it cuts your rights, or they invade your private space, not evade. Then the way you're gonna react, for example, is gonna be more anger related, and it's not gonna, you're not gonna think of a reason. I don't know.
So I guess I get your point, and I guess the most important thing is to listen to the other person and try to bring them back to the present moment.
Yeah, definitely.
In order for their anger to calm a little bit and focus on the topic that needs to be resolved, because otherwise the topic will never be resolved.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
And the other important thing is to know where the attention needs to be. So by trying to get the attention on us for whatever reason might not be the best thing to do when we want to resolve a topic. Maybe giving the attention to the other person can help actually redirect the conversation to where it needs to be.
I'd like to add to what you said. There's always two sides to a story. No one is ever completely right, no one's ever completely wrong. So I think people should focus on what the other person has done right instead of what the other person has done wrong, So and not have a fixed idea of something in their minds. So for example, let's say there's a couple arguing, okay? You can have one person that says, no, it was this way, I did this right, and you did this wrong. Instead of saying you did this wrong, you can say, I did this right, you did this right, but where did we not match? Where was the exclusion? What happened and we fell out the margins, for example?
Yeah. So, I guess you added very well to the point of attention, giving the attention to where it needs to be for the matter to get resolved.
Definitely, and like when arguing with whoever, or like not necessarily arguing, having a more intense conversation with someone, you should try to look at their point of view.
Yeah.
I know that it's like when you feel like your point of view is like it's like the only right way, because that's what happens when I argue, for example. I feel like my point of view is the only right way. There is no other point of view to this conversation, this situation. Then that doesn't allow me to understand the other person and therefore resolve the matter in a calm way, because it's like it's my way or the highway, right?
Yeah. So I guess empathetically guiding the conversation to where it needs to go, showing empathy and trying to understand where the other person comes from.
Yeah.
Good. So just to sum up the ideas that we talked about, we need to use leading, so knowing where the intention needs to be for the matter to be resolved. Following, so allowing our attention to follow someone else's point. Recentering, to be able to show empathy to what the other person is talking about. And feeding, so speaking one information at a time so the other person can digest.
Yep.
I think we've done a good job.
Yeah, I think we did. And I specifically liked empathy and feeding, it's because it helps to tone down a conversation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.